Okay, folks, I think we're live, if I'm not mistaken. We're just going to wait just a few minutes to let some folks settle in. We will be having our conversation here shortly. Hang tight.
Hello.
Hey, Talia, how are you?
Good.
Good.
Sorry to be a little late.
Oh, you're good. You're right on time. So we'll go ahead and get started then. I've just got a couple of things programming notes to mention before we get going. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Cool. Great. 1 second. Okay, so hello, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Public Knowledge's virtual book talk celebrating Talia Levin's Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. My name is AJ Bauer, and I'm a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, as well as a co-organizer of the IPK Working Group on the Global New Right, which is hosting our event this evening. Before we get started, I want to thank the IPK for its ongoing support of the Global New Right Working Group, as well as to thank my co-organizers of that group, Maya Vinkar and Leif Weatherby. And especially to thank as well Jess Coffey, Zari Loom, Ari Figueroa for their key technical and logistical support that made tonight's virtual event possible. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Talia for writing this remarkable and thought-provoking book, for sharing her work with us, and for joining me tonight to discuss it. One more brief housekeeping note. This video is streaming live on Twitter and YouTube, or so I'm told. These are sites of the scene of the crime in many cases for much of Talia's book, which we'll get into in a second. And so we're going to be taking questions from the audience and answering those questions starting around 6 o'clock or so. But you don't need to wait to ask your questions. So if you have questions as we're speaking, feel free to post those questions to the YouTube chat interface or to tweet them at NYU_IPK. And my colleagues behind the scenes will be filtering and feeding those questions to me so that I can ask them. Without further ado, I think that's how you say it. Talia, welcome. Thank you again for joining us in this virtual way. First off, I thought for folks who haven't got a chance to read this book yet, which I guess I should do this specific book, yes. There should be a link for folks who are interested in buying a copy or haven't got a copy yet in the YouTube page. But in any event, for those who haven't had a chance to buy yet and haven't had a chance to read this captivating, and it just breezes through from page 1 to the end. It's a very quick read, it feels like, which I think is a testament to your writing. For those who haven't read it yet, what brought you to this topic of online white supremacy, and what inspired you to write a book about it?
I know you well, AJ, from the last event about the far right I did at IPK. I've been reporting on this for a while. Like a lot of people, I was sort of galvanized after Unite the Right in Charlottesville, particularly by the open anti-Semitism of that event. You know, as a Jew, it really sort of spurred me into belated action. And subsequently, I've faced, a slew of harassment from the far right, often very personal, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, and my reaction was finding the abyss looking at me, rather than sort of turning away or quieting down. I'm a pretty stubborn person, so I just chose to look back into the abyss and drag it out into the light.
Yeah, and it's very clear you do a great job of illuminating. So throughout the book, you keep coming back in different ways to a similar refrain, which in one of the ways you write it is, the worst people are still people. And so it seems to me in this, you're kind of certainly giving your subjects a lot more than they're willing to give you in a lot of cases, right? In terms of empathy and connectivity. Why do you find this point, that the worst people are still people, worth emphasizing?
Well, I don't know that I see that as a point of empathy necessarily. mean, the book is pretty uncompromisingly anti-fascist. I like to flatter myself that it is at any rate.
Mhm.
Um, I find that the idea that to engage in bigotry of the most vicious kind and the most harmful kind, um, and including violence and harassment, is the culmination of a series of dozens or hundreds of human choices. I don't find that to be exculpatory or a locus of empathy in particular.
Mhm.
What I want to do is to prevent people from sort of dismissing the issue and dismissing the threat, by saying these people are monsters, these people are inhuman, these people are unrecognizable to me, when in fact, many of them are middle or upper middle class, IPK, NYU, sort of socioeconomic and educational level
Mhm.
folks. And so I think there is an element of sort of self-protectiveness, I think, in the white liberal tendency to either dismiss white supremacists and members of the white power movement as either inhuman monsters or sort of uniquely poor, uniquely disenfranchised, uniquely traumatized. Whereas anyone can be drawn into this path. It could be someone in your neighborhood, it could be someone who works with you, it could be someone, in any sort of job, any walk of life. And that's sort of a persistent theme in the book, that there is no appropriate occasion for complacency in the United States.
Yeah, and you do a great job in the book of charting these kind of multiple different kind of entry trajectories for getting into the white supremacist movement online, right? You look at folks that are using dating apps and plug in that way. You see folks that plug in through these kind of openly misogynist sites that end up getting more connected into more overtly racist and anti-Semitic kind of tracks. You track the kind of Gamergate phenomenon and entry point in. I think that, so after Trump's election in 2016 and after the events of Charlottesville that you talk about in the book as well, we've heard lots of public calls for empathy. And this is why I kind of jumped the gun on asking you about it in the first. But it strikes me that a lot of these calls, like you said, are this kind of like empathy, and the kind I'm thinking about here is kind of Arlie Hochschild's notion of empathy walls that supposedly kind of prevent us from understanding one another, exacerbating feelings of irreconcilable worldviews and tribalism between the left and right. And a lot of times this gets narrated in a liberal way as though this is a bad thing, right? And that we need to use empathy as a way of bridging those walls or climbing over the walls or whatever the metaphor is, right? And one of the things I really appreciate about your book that I think is really fascinating is to some extent your method, right, in developing these elaborate, believable characters, right, this Ashlyn and Tommy avatars, right, requires a sort of putting yourself into the shoes of your enemy, right? The ability to make not only an avatar, but to make it compelling to people who are of that community, right, requires a sort of kind of authenticity or connection to it, right? And so that being said, your vision doesn't, or your kind of approach doesn't result in some kind of cozy reconciliation, which I think a lot of the conversations about empathy tend to do, but falls back into this kind of notion of, anti-fascism. And you mentioned a lot, or the way that it made you hate, right? So what role does empathy play in this project? It seems like this is a term you don't necessarily use, but to what extent do you find this kind of being able to relate to or understand your enemy, right, as being a crucial political project?
Well, I mean, the reason that I had to go to these lengths, right, in order to penetrate these communities is because I, as a Jewish woman, as, a queer woman, as someone who has been outspoken against the far right, I'm not someone that they categorize as human. The way they speak about me is inhuman. The rape and death threats are not something you would, level at someone who you perceive to be equally human as you. And so I needed to engage in the subterfuge just to be able to get a sense of the rank and file. And that was the goal. It wasn't empathy, particularly. Yes, I did have to get into some, frankly, weird and disturbing mindsets in order to adequately sort of penetrate these communities and listen into what they were saying in private, um, when they thought no one else was listening. But I think that I am not a big fan of this whole like hug a Nazi kind of idea, or the infamous headline in the Jewish Daily Forward, we need to start befriending neo-Nazis. Like, no, that's not where I stand. I think it is important to understand the human motivations behind white nationalism, white power. I think it's important to understand the codes, the histories, the mythos they draw on. But this is purely in the service of dismantling a political project, a movement whose sole goals are power and violence. And so, I think you can empathize with people for winding up in a situation where they find a world washed with blood and cruelty to be the only way forward on an abstract level. But I don't find that instrumentalizing that empathy, that advocating for sort of a kumbaya coexistence with people who want to murder me and my family and people who look like me and think like me is a particularly useful way of moving forward. And so I emphasize wanting to understand their motivations as a means to defeat their movement, which I think must be root and stock destroyed.
Yeah, and I think this is something that comes across very strongly in the book and is one of the more compelling aspects of the book to me, is that it does make that move of trying to understand, but without withholding judgment. You're able to both achieve understanding and judgment simultaneously in ways that I feel like, there's these kind of tug of war between those two values, especially among popular kind of liberal discourse. I think you really navigate that well and stand your ground very well. One kind of theme that you come back to kind of at the kind of bookending the book towards the beginnings and the end is how this process, this journey to kind of better understand these neo-Nazis online caused you to feel the kind of affect of hate, right, or feelings of hatred. How did this project help you tap into a feeling of hatred that's different than you've been able to experience in your life outside of it?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. I'm sorry.
So how did I
So,
tap into hatred that was different from my life outside?
or before doing this kind of project. So how do you experience hate differently now, right, in your life versus before you started writing this book?
Well, I started out knowing like too much already. I learned a lot more. I think I'm more attuned to the danger it poses. I'm more marinated in it. It's sort of soaked into me like a brined pickle in just absolute filth. So I'm a filthy pickle of a human being. Frankly, after spending nearly 2 years just like reading these genocidal chats day in and day out. And yes, I'm still embedded. I'm still looking. I'm watching, especially the week before the election.
Yeah.
I would say, and I've had the FBI come to my house and tell me that people want to kill and rape me. So it's made my life a little bit smaller, a little more paranoid. I'm kind of jumpy and watching my six, and worried about civil war. I think really examining these chat rooms that had tens of thousands of members, spending all this time watching what they were saying to each other in these spaces where they felt comfortable made me realize how pervasive this phenomenon is, and also how pervasive sympathy to these phenomena are. I think it's very easy to fall back on this idea of kind of a broad benevolence of the public, and I don't feel that way anymore. I feel that this country is in a moment where it's really tainted by the forces of hate and really warped by it. I hope to see that recede in my lifetime, but a Pandora's box has been opened, and only a little bit of hope remains.
Yeah. And so getting into a little bit more of your method. I've shared your piece that was published in The Nation this summer. It was just, I think it was How to Be an Anti-Fascist from Your Couch. with many students who have been interested in this idea of how do you go about researching these far-right phenomenon, like how do you get access and all these kinds of things. I wonder whether you might share just a little bit of how you did what you did, right? For young journalists out there, young activists out there that want to engage in a similar kind of practice. I guess the first question is, do you recommend this for other young scholars and activists that want to investigate this topic? And if so, how do you go about setting up fake accounts? Like, how did you ensure your anonymity and pull off this ruse?
Well, without compromising too many of my methods, because again, I'm still engaged in this kind of undercover work, I would say this to young journalists and activists who are interested in penetrating and investigating the far right. I'm not going to recommend you not do it. I'm not some sort of gatekeeper. I will say it can do things to your mind. It can really screw with your head. Please be sure that you have a support network of people you can talk to about it, who can sort of talk you down from the airless space that really marinating in hate can put you into. Emotionally, make sure that you have a really solid sort of group of people who will keep you grounded. Then in terms of security, there are a lot of guides to operational security, to digital security out there. Don't be using your real number as you're infiltrating groups on Telegram or Discord or whatever. Don't be using your real email. Don't be using your real name. Put up as many layers between you and your persona as possible. Don't reference where you live. Try not to geolocate any of your photos. Don't post where you are when you're there. Tallpoppy.io is a pretty great resource for, I think they're based in California, but they do some great tips on how to lock down your digital presence. Make sure that your passwords aren't replicated across different platforms. Just put in place a digital security plan before you start engaging in this stuff. And then as to how to do it, I would say the most effective way to start being an anti-fascist from your couch, being an investigator, is start with your town, start with your community. So much of anti-fascism is about community defense. That's really the sort of watchword of it. That's the core of what anti-fascism is keeping your community safe from far-right organizing. And so start with your town, figure out who are the hate groups active in your area. If someone's posting hinky stuff on Facebook, maybe figure out if they're aligned with one of these formal groups. If there's Patriot Front, propaganda being plastered across your campus, try to find out who the people who are hanging that stuff are. There are also some amazing resources out there, thanks to, enterprising people who are combating the far right. Unicorn Riot has these tremendous archives of leaks from the Unite the Right planning chats, and subsequently, there's a wonderful website called ironmarch.exposed that has almost the entirety of every message and post from the late and not lamented Facebook of Nazis. And so search your town, search, the police department in your town, search, members of the military around you. Like, these are organizations that white nationalists are keen to join and recruit from. Check out the Young Republicans on campus, see if they've invited any white nationalist speakers lately. There are known sort of loci where white nationalists like to recruit, to organize. And so, if there is white nationalist activity in your town, take that as your starting point. Don't try to take on the whole nation at once. Start from where you are and see where it goes from there.
That's great. That's a lot of really helpful resources. I'm sure that my students out there are starting to Google or search up a lot of those things already.
Oh, I hope you didn't make them watch this for credit.
I made nothing. I made nothing. I just said that, hey, they might want to. So one thing that I found really fascinating, especially as you're kind of narrating the avatars of Ashlyn and Tommy, right? How did you go about, I mean, did it feel like writing a novel or something? Like, how did you go about creating those personas and like imagining them? Like, what sorts of research reading? Was it just having like consumed a lot of these chats and have a sense of what these people look for? Or how did you go about building those kind of, that sense of interiority that you were able to get to those characters?
Well, I wrote a novel once, you know, I have a drawer novel.
Mhm,
I'm a writer.
mhm,
Creativity comes naturally to me.
mhm,
I was really flying on the seat of my pants for a lot of the book.
mhm,
And there are a lot of personas and avatars that I made that weren't as successful, that sort of didn't make their way in.
mhm,
Um, I didn't chronicle as many of the false starts as I could have. So what you see is sort of the successful ones. But I mean, I was really playing towards the fantasy that I saw, the fantasies that I saw playing out. In the case of Ashlyn, it was the fantasy of the hyper submissive, you know, woman, the Aryan woman of their dreams. In the case of the incel character, Tommy O'Hara, it was really, I just read a lot of what incels were saying and then, you know, tried to mirror that successfully enough to sort of get into their private chats. I mean, their agendas are pretty obvious, and if you listen to the way they talk long enough, you learn how to pick it up. Um, it's not as complicated as they'd like to think. I mean, they do use a lot of codes. They do have a lot of references to like Nazi mysticism from like the 1940s and the Crusades and whatnot, but you pick it up. You know, you sit and you watch and you wait and you learn, and then you can speak, and then you can goad people into revealing who they are. You know, but yes, it was an exercise in sort of watching, waiting, and learning enough until I felt comfortable enough to do that kind of infiltration work on a higher level. And then I did do a lot of reading for the book, mostly because I tried to also posit, like, situate all of this in its historical context, particularly the history of anti-Semitism in the United States and the history of the white power movement in the United States. And I drew on some excellent books. Even if you don't like my book, the endnotes section is a pretty good set of resources on books to educate yourself on white nationalism, from Mark Bray's Antifa, the Antifascist Handbook, to Kathleen Bellew's Bring the War Home, to Eric Foner on Reconstruction, to Anti-Semitism in America by Leonard Dinerstein. I mean,
mhm.
you know, you can't write a book without reading a lot of books.
Right. All great books, but worth noting that this book here is a really good synthesis of those books. So maybe just read
Yeah,
this one
hey,
for
look,
now, and then you can
it's
plug
this
into those
hot,
others too.
it's the hot new fall accessory. It's my small red child. I worked very hard on it and people want to kill me about it, so you should buy it. That's my
Yes,
take.
yes, for sure. Um, so um, getting in a little bit to some of the kind of, uh, well, actually, wait, let me ask a separate question first. Are the folks in these alt-right chats, are they talking about like Nazi literature and philosophy? Or is it much more like, to what extent are they engaging with actually kind of philosophical and theoretical treatises? Or to what extent are they kind of more engaging with popular, or not popular culture, but kind of current events and things? Or is it a fusion of the two?
There are a lot of different tendencies within the far right. You know, I don't want to flatten it out. Like
Yeah.
there are, and you know, within the context of even just like Telegram chats, there are ones dedicated to different things. So, you know, you can join a chat dedicated entirely to like Hitlerian occultism or, you know, heathenry, uh, you know, racist heathenry or whatever. I will say that the practice of sharing foundational texts like Mein Kampf and the Turner Diaries, but also stuff that was more obscure, making audiobooks for one another, engaging in that kind of almost like semi-samizdat cultural production, sharing texts about phrenology and eugenics was a large part of the stuff I saw. And then, of course, there was an attendant focus on current events, or at least it was more like a Black person did a crime and we're going to talk about it. Like it wasn't, I mean, hate sites in general sort of mirror and like are parasitical off mainstream news, particularly right-wing outlets. They sort of just like refract them through an even more racist lens. You know, focus on crime by leftists, by Jews, by Black people, by immigrants, by Muslims. And so there was a lot of that, you know, a lot of advocating of violence. It was less like they were like analyzing articles from Politico or whatever, and more like just like engaging in today's, you know, acts of racism around whatever they saw in the news. And that was synthesized with discussion of theory, with drawing on these historical proof texts.
Yeah, and so throughout the book, you talk about these kind of launderers, you call them, right? That help make these ideas kind of circulate outside of these darker spaces into the light a little more in different ways, more palatable ways, more mainstream ways. Do you make, or how do you make a distinction between the kind of style and content of conservative news sites, right? Like Breitbart or Daily Caller, or like New York Post more recently, or a lot recently, and more explicit white supremacist sites like Daily Stormer or VDare, things like this. How are these different parts of the right-wing media ecosystem, like how are they connected, and how are they, or are they doing different projects? How do you see them as being in conversation?
That's a good question. And of course, in the Trump era, as the zone has become ever more flooded with, you know, ever more open white nationalist sentiment, the lines have gotten a lot blurrier. But we've seen people get fired from the Daily Caller for being open white nationalists, right? Being, you know, engaged in formal white nationalist organizations. Like there is at least nominally a line. And I think the line, it's like a lot of the content, of course, Breitbart used to have a Black crime tag, you know, the lines are blurry, but, you know, it's like basically racial and ethnic slurs and overtly crude language and, you know, dispensing with even the veneer of sort of like trying to ape a news organization in any fashion. I mean, that's what you see from the hate sites. But the content is largely parasitical. I mean, the Daily Stormer and its style guide admits like most of what they do is take, you know, right-wing oriented news and then just remix it in like a more overtly anti-Semitic, more racist way. So, you know, the far right news sites are sort of parasitical on mainstream right news, but, you know, we've also seen that, you know, Breitbart editors read VDare. We've seen that there's a lot of traffic and conversation both ways, you know, and that more open, more militant white nationalism plays a role in shaping the ideas that give rise to the mainstream rights news.
And so
you know, you have people on 4chan saying Kyle Rittenhouse did nothing wrong. That's the guy who shot two protesters dead in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And, you know, then you have Tucker Carlson saying the same thing. You know, and a Tucker Carlson writer was recently fired for posting racial slurs. Like the lines are very blurry, but what really distinguishes sort of a hate site from a mainstream right news site is at this point really just the existence of slurs and like just another level of sort of crudity in the language.
Do the hate sites have like actual reporting, or is it mostly just this kind of synthesizing accounts, reporting by other people, and then giving it a different or a different framing?
It's all aggregation. I mean, these aren't. I mean, the one thing they might add is like doxing.
Yeah.
Or, you know, they might take the extra step of kind of someone who's mentioned in a derogatory fashion in a mainstream news site, they might like elaborate and embroider and pull up more stuff. But no, these are parasitical organizations.
Mhm.
They're not like fearless investigative journalists.
Right.
They're sitting on their couches hating people.
Right. So what about on the audience side of that? So like in the kind of Telegram chats that you're, interrupting or looking around in, right? Do you get the sense that folks are kind of insulated just consuming those hate sites, or do you see, are people like talking about Tucker and Hannity and like, do they, do you get a sense that they're watching Fox and reading these conservative outlets in addition to the hate sites, or what kind of overlap do you see that in terms of audience?
Well, the group that I specifically address in the book is like very online. They're not necessarily watching Fox News, but if like a particularly inflammatory Tucker clip gets posted to Twitter, they'll talk about it. They might be talking about these hate sites, but no, they have, and again, it depends on the person. It depends on the tendency. Like, I don't see like the Times and the Atlantic necessarily getting like linked all the time, but it's like, and it's not entirely clear to me what their information diet truly consists of, because these are places where they come to talk hate. I don't think these are like the most informed news junkie consumers. It's more like, filtered through a prism of their social media feeds and YouTube, and then also just like whatever catches someone's eye that particular day.
So changing gears a little, you write at length and really eloquently about the complex relationship between misogyny and white supremacism online in particular. I was especially struck by these love letters that you include, that you received from Nazis. And they struck me as not only like extremely racist, but also like incredibly emotionally stunted. Like not like romantic, like they may consider themselves romantics, but these are very stunted letters. You'll see if you read the book. I wonder if you might elaborate a bit on the relationship you found between toxic masculinity and white supremacism online. Obviously they're related, right? But how do you see them as being related?
Yeah, so just to be clear, these weren't love letters to me, Talia Lavin.
Right.
This was in the context of me infiltrating a whites-only dating site,
Yeah.
whitedate.net, which has called me an anti-white Jewish woman and was like very, very pissed about this whole situation. Once the Nation the excerpt that featured that. So I asked them to write love letters to their ideal white wife, and they sent me some, and I quote them in the book. Toxic masculinity, and so I can read one if you like.
Sure. Yeah.
So this was let me see. The world will not forgive us for this. It will not forget. It seeks to destroy this beauty, our beauty. It wishes that we would vanish, that our progeny would never come to pass. It hates and loathes us. This is a heavy burden we must bear, and with it we must arm ourselves against this world. Our revolt will be joyous laughter echoing in the great hall. Our revenge will be the smiling faces of our children. We shall prevail, there is no doubt. I only seek to share this great journey with you. There are untold adventures that we shall embark on, and great challenges that we shall overcome. Our pack shall be strong, taking time to hunt and feed and play. Through us, we shall exert our will upon the world and shape it in our own image. This I promise you. So, yeah, you can really see the echoes of toxic masculinity there. This idea of like comparing your children to a wolf pack, this insistence that the world loathes white people and their progeny against all evidence to the contrary. I think toxic masculinity was like the hallmark of all the stuff I saw. I mean, it was just everywhere. The dialogue between these people was so unremittingly puerile, replete with like homophobia, just constant homophobia, not even just like the sort of transphobia and like homosexuality is a Jewish plot that sort of formed part of their ideology, but also kind of this like locker roomish, like deeply homophobic way of sort of interacting with one another, that towed the line between like homoeroticism and homophobia. They would spam each other's chats with gay porn if they got in feuds, stuff like that. I think one reason I wrote about misogyny at such length is because I really feel that it's inextricable from discussing the white supremacist project at large. Not only because it forms such a crucial entry point into, the white supremacist movement online, like so many people get their permission to engage in hatred and harassment, and sort of form their first ideas that the socially progressive ideology, to wit feminism, is what's like keeping them down and making them discontented, and forms the sort of degeneracy of modern life. Like that's their entry point. And then like, what about Black people? What about Jews? It forms the start for a lot of people. And the misogynistic Gamergate movement was really a beta test for a lot of the stuff we've seen in terms of broader white supremacist internet activity. So it does form this crucial entry point, but then within the ideology, this idea of like propagating the white race through submissive female breeders, is such a huge cornerstone. I mean, like the white supremacist sort of catechism is the 14 words: we must secure the future for ourselves and for our white children. And like the children aspect means you have to have white, chaste, ossified, gender rolled brides. And you see that in the trad wife movement, covered admirably by Sayward Darby in her book Sisters in Hate, but which unfortunately I wasn't able to penetrate as nimbly. They're a little cannier than their male counterparts, and my attempts to infiltrate that community were a little bit more stunted. If I'd had more time, I would have tried a little harder or just worked on it harder. There are certainly women who do their damnedest to uphold white supremacy. There always have been, from the women of the KKK and onward. And there are white women, as we see in like the many, 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 many white women who vote for Trump. There are women who choose white supremacy over a kind of multiracial equality, in the belief that their proximity to white male power will afford them, sufficient power, rather than attaining it on their own or lifting up other people as they go. So, misogyny is really at the core of white supremacy: hatred of the modern woman, of female sexuality, of female assertiveness, is such a humongous part of what drives them. Female reporters on the beat get disproportionate harassment, death threats, sexualized violence directed towards us. And attacks on feminists and feminism are really a very core element to the movement in ways that I think cannot be overstated.
Yeah, I wish that I thought I had to get some like old timey Civil War era music to play over your reading there, because it felt almost like Ken Burn documentary. You know what I'm talking about? This like
well, it's this very
self-consciously
masculine style of prose, and you see it in the manifestos as well.
Yeah.
Particularly the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter. He speaks in this sort of elevated, almost like dollar store Beowulf kind of tone, where he's really consciously trying to ape the sort of masculine prose of a saga. And I think that really speaks to this idea of like your white manhood is under attack. That forms so much of the locus of the paranoia. Like, anything that they perceive as sort of antithetical to a very narrow Western masculine idea, they posit as a Jewish plot. I mean, everything is a Jewish plot. Trans rights are a Jewish plot. Gay rights are a Jewish plot. Feminism is a Jewish plot. And that was like so ubiquitous as a sentiment. So they really imprison themselves in this idea of like, you know, we've got to do strength training, we've got to acquire weapons, we've got to be physically fit and Aryan men ready to do battle for the white race. It's all about violence, it's all about power, and it's all about this very narrow, very violent, very toxic idea of masculinity.
Mhm. And it's all like it's like they don't have enough of they don't have the words or the ways to express their own feelings. Like this, that's too gay or something like that, right? It's like too insufficiently masculine or something like that. And so they rely upon these kind of like older tropes or something, it seems like, to get access to it. I just keep drawing back to this one section of one of the letters, a different one that you read, where you had asked them specifically to write about like what they would say to their white wife, right? Which I just watched Borat last night, which I do not recommend, but also
I liked it. Sorry.
I was like not into it. But anyway, every time I see white wife now, I'm thinking of it in a Borat accent.
Wife.
Yeah, but he starts this, or the second paragraph says, to answer your question, well, I'd have to think about that. It's kind of hard to imagine being married at last, right? And it's like, why are you saying you have to think about this? The whole point of the letter is, right, there's some lack of artistry there. And so I wonder whether it's like, these people live such stunted emotional lives in a lot of cases, it seems like, that they see these kind of, visions of kind of grandiose existences in these kind of white supremacist texts that somehow gives them a way of communicating that they feel like they can't communicate because of their lack of, I don't know what it is. What you got there?
Oh no, just I was trying to figure out a way to like inconspicuously display the book, and I'm gonna wedge it under my arm. Yeah,
it's good.
No, I mean, so I think, I think, a culture that allows men so little room to express their feelings except through anger, except through violence. One of the products is going to be like this kind of culture that takes an extra step and says like, you must harness your anger and your violence, and like your anger and your violence and the civilizational collapse that it will lead to can like let us build our ethnically cleansed state from the ruins. Like, really, I think there is a direct connection between the narrowness of the emotional range that our culture allows men and like the appeal of this movement, which is so fundamentally based on anger.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this next question is kind of based a little bit on what you just said, in the sense that you do this really deft work throughout the book of managing to avoid this like firm distinction between mainstream and fringe, where it's almost like these dynamics are going on and suffused throughout society, but they're happening in like a more intense way in these spaces. But that doesn't mean that they're fringe necessarily, because a lot of those ideas are embedded in very mainstream elements of society. Normative major normal masculinity in the United States, right, has a lot of the harbingers of this too, even if it isn't played out in the same way always, right? So the question that this raises for me is like, so we live in a white supremacist country, right, that is not white supremacist enough for self-actualizing white supremacists. How do we talk about that, right? So Donald Trump is a racist, right? We can say that, but he's not exactly a racist in the same way as the guys that you study, right? How do we distinguish between the two, right? This kind of, overt or, unabashed white supremacy. How do we talk about that as similar to but distinct from the white supremacy that infuses all of our lives, even if we're unfamiliar with these sectors of the internet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And it's a question I appreciate. And it was a really difficult thing to really make that distinction. And I did try to point out the ways in which white supremacy underlies so many things in our country, the ways in which racism, both naked and casual and more veiled, are sort of underpin so much about our daily lives. I do feel it's important to talk about its more extreme manifestations, both because they form a physical threat to, Jews, to Muslims, to trans people, gay people, anyone that doesn't fit that Aryan masculine ideal, as we've seen played out tragically, in multiple mass casualty incidents over the past few years, and which unfortunately I fear we may see play out over the next month. I really hope to be proven wrong, but for people who are accelerationists who thrive on and desire chaos and collapse, this does seem to be a pretty opportune moment. And so I hope there are not mass casualty events in the coming days, and that I am just a baseless prophet of doom, but it's something that's keeping every far-right expert I know up at night, is that prospect.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you have to draw those distinctions, and you draw them carefully. I also think the other reason to study this sort of extreme phenomenon is because then, like, understanding the sort of mythos, motivations, underlying historical patterns that give rise to the white power movement has also helped me understand more quote unquote mainstream racism as well. A lot of the same adoration of eugenics, the same anti-Semitic kind of tropes, the same loathing of all that is feminine, really permeates so much of our mainstream society as well. And so I found that through my study of extremism, I've come to understand America better and differently as a whole.
Yeah.
I think it's not without value to explore the edge case when it comes to understanding the mainstream as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that really shines throughout the book, and you do a good job of narrating that, right? Of this idea that even though these people are considered to be fringe, or these communities are kind of outside the beaten path or outside of our vision, that there's ways that a lot of this feels very familiar, right? I mean, especially as a young man who grew up in Texas, right? A lot of the kind of homophobic jokes and other kinds of masculine jokes at the expense of women, or anti-feminist jokes or whatever. Like, I heard a lot of that growing up, right? In not a way that was, necessarily connected to the white supremacist movement in that particular setting. But you can definitely see how that lends in there, how that becomes kind of a pathway into white supremacy, especially with, like you mentioned, accelerationists towards violence, but it's also like the internet itself is kind of an accelerant, right, on this phenomenon in another way.
Yeah, I mean, these bigotries are interwoven, they're braided, and we see how misogyny, I mean, with the Amy Coney Barrett fast-tracked appointment, with the express goal of suppressing women's rights, like, we see how misogyny and white supremacy share the same goals, how one feeds the other and vice versa. These are not abstractly intertwined, but rather explicitly so. And like, that plays out in our day-to-day lives. I do think the cautionary aspect of writing a book like this is like, there are so many people who want to see racism as a KKK hood or a swastika, and like, that's what racism is, right? And they don't want to talk about police violence, about mass incarceration, about healthcare discrimination, or the reasons why we don't have a social safety net in this country, which are, of course, intimately intertwined with racism. But again, I've found that, like, looking into racism in its most extreme manifestations, looking into what undergirds those sentiments, looking into what those people say, allows you to understand the sort of more quote unquote mainstream stuff too, because a lot of the same assumptions undergird both.
Yeah, I think that's right for sure. So although this is a book that's dark and heavy subject matter throughout, there are considerable moments of levity, not only in your writing, which is often very, full of humor and jokes, often self-deprecating, but otherwise as well. But there's also some places where, like, Nazis have jokes, weirdly enough. Like, the line that made me laugh out loud the most is at some point they talk about the night of the wrong wives, which is a play off the Night of the Long Knives, right? And that's just very funny, right? And so I'm wondering, even though, you can get into the book about what that was, but what role does humor play both within the kind of online white supremacist spaces that you study, but also within your own method of researching and writing about them?
Well, first of all, the Night of the Wrong Knives is actually
Lives, yeah.
was actually coined by anti-fascists.
Okay, so
So
see, that's where the cleverness comes from. I knew that there was a reason I was laughing at it.
yeah, but like one example of the way neo-Nazis use humor was like one particular neo-Nazi podcast that recently spent a disturbing amount of time discussing like my fingernails and sausage-like fingers. I think they're pretty normal, but you know, whatever, your mileage may vary. Is called the Daily Shoah, right? Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. It's obviously a pun on the Daily Show.
Right.
You know, and I think this serves, you know, so neo-Nazis, white supremacists, white power movementarians use humor a lot. You can see that in, you know, one really illustrative document is the Daily Stormer Style Guide, which was leaked to Ashley Feinberg at HuffPost. And she posted, and one of the telling lines, I think, is like, normies shouldn't be able to tell if we're joking or not. You know, when we say gas the kikes, like you should be a little bit uncertain if I really mean it, even though I really do. So they're very explicit about weaponizing humor as a means to lull people into a sense of sort of, okay, I'm just going along with this, I'm just joking. And so, you know, a lot of the kind of humor, internet humor of like the early aughts and even later is sort of this shock jock South Park humor where you engage in kind of racist speech, sexist speech for shock value. But once you're employing racial slurs against people, that's not a joke anymore. I mean, you're just being a racist. But it conditions you to like engage in that. It you know, once you reference the Holocaust as a joke enough times, it stops being serious to you. Its value erodes. Once you joke about killing people enough times, their humanity erodes to you. And so, you know, there's a lot of humor, often crude, sometimes clever, that pervades these environments. And I think it's used as a way to kind of condition you to accept things that are more and more violent, more and more outre. Accept them, embrace them, move on to the next thing, which you will also be conditioned by a sort of envelope of humor into taking in and making part of yourself and your worldview. And in terms of the way I combated it, I mean, as one of my dearest friends likes to say, life without humor is just one long dental appointment. I think, you know, you can't approach something like this without being able to laugh at it sometimes. I think that there is a danger in sort of saying it's all a joke. I don't think it is a joke. I think it's a deadly serious threat. But I tried not to lose my sense of humor as I engaged in it. And one other point about humor is that white supremacist groups very conspicuously often adopt sort of ludicrous kind of names. The Boogaloo Boys, right? The Proud Boys,
right,
named after a song from the musical Aladdin, right?
Right.
And you can see like and they do this kind of deliberately, because if you're going around saying like the Boogaloo Boys are a national security threat, right? You can hear those words coming out of your mouth sounding a bit ridiculous. They name themselves in silly ways so that
Right.
when you name the threat, you sound alarmist, right? And you can see the antecedents to this very clearly and very deliberately in, for example, the original KKK emerging during Reconstruction, right? They didn't always wear white hoods. The emergence of the white hood as sort of the standard KKK uniform really came after Birth of a Nation. They would dress up in like carnival costumes. They would dress up as clowns and then engage in brutal depredation and violence, you know, but they would do it to a soundtrack of like goofy music that they would play, you know, they would play carnival songs during lynchings. Like, and they did this because, you know, first of all, it underscored the humiliation, degradation, and pain of their victims. And second of all, they did it for the benefit of their apologists, who would then say, oh, it's just some guy is making jokes. It's just some people having a bit of fun, at the expense of Black people. So the weaponization of humor, the weaponization of ridiculousness is definitely has been part of the white power movement for a very long time. That's why you have names like the Grand Dragon and the Grand Wizard. I don't think there is a conscious understanding that this is ridiculous and a weaponization of that ridicule. And there's also the Jean-Paul Sartre said it best in his essay Anti-Semite and Jew. I'm sure you're familiar with this, that the anti-Semite, the bigot, doesn't need to engage with truth in the same way. Is free to have fun and free to play, because to him, this is not a deadly serious issue in the way that it is for his victims. And so, I think that's another part of it. So humor, plays a big, complicated role, and you could write a whole book about humor and white supremacy in the United States.
Or you could. That could be the next book.
Oh boy, I don't know. I have a couple of stories that people have, very graciously given me about what white nationalists are getting up to in their towns, and for their sake, I want to report those out. But I want to take a little break from Nazis and write about Pleasant Fall soups, or the history of madness, or something. I am hated out for a little while.
Yeah, you've earned a vacation for sure. So one other question, or one and a half other questions. The half question is, so I'm compelled by this argument about the weaponization of humor on the right, and I find it to be very disturbing, as I'm sure that you do and we all do. What does that mean for humor? What does that mean for anti-fascist humor? Because I think that there's a way that there's a sort of if we make Trump and fascism seem silly and absurdist, that this is going to detooth it in some way. That goes on in a lot of kind of online liberal Twitter discourse. And it doesn't seem terribly effective. But I wonder, is it playing into that right-wing militarization or weaponization of humor that you're talking about? Or is that just us staying alive with gallows humor?
Complicated question. I mean, I think that anti-fascists use humor effectively sometimes. I mean, sometimes it can, especially when we talk about toxic masculinity, one aspect of toxic masculinity is taking yourself very seriously. So cutting them down to size, mocking them individually, calling them out for the chuds they are, is an anti-fascist tactic, can be used effectively. It's a difficult line to toe, because you want to, again, show how ridiculous they are, show how small they are, without, dismissing the reality of the threat. And when it comes to more broad, sort of mainline liberal humor, I mean, as a leftist, I have my own skepticisms. I find particularly this fixation on depicting Trump as gay, depicting Trump as gay with Putin.
Yeah.
All these sort of leather daddy visual gags, this obsession with Mike Pence is gay, is so counterproductive. It's oh, all your enemies are gay because being gay is bad and silly. Right. This is just another sort of manifestation of toxic masculinity to me. And then the other thing is the constant fixation on the physical attributes of Trump, this idea that he's fat and weak and can't walk upstairs. Some of the bravest comrades I have are disabled, can't walk up a flight of stairs. Some of the smartest, sharpest anti-fascist thinkers out there are people who are impacted by the eugenic style thinking of this movement and its echoes. Sorry, that's a smoker's cough, not a COVID cough. And its echoes in the mainstream right. So, and fat women of color, neo-Nazis obsess over their physiques. like obsess over the existence of fat women, hate fat women with like almost an animal repulsion, and fixate on it. And like as a fat woman, I've been the target of that kind of sentiment. And so I do find this sort of fixation on this idea that like Trump has a belly and that's the most disgusting thing about him. You can summon like this is a fascist, and you know what you can do is sort of say he's fat. Good, congratulations. Like I don't find that
Right.
especially furthering to the cause, although this is veered way into my own personal bugbears. You know, I think a lot about like one of my heroes is the poet Osip Mandelstam, who is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poet from the sort of Silver Age in Russia. And he was sent to the gulag for like, you know, he was exiled and died in exile because he wrote a poem making fun of Stalin's mustache, saying it looked like cockroaches, and oh, you like your boot, you enjoy the sound of your boots like walking over the heads of your enemies, right? He read it privately at a party. Someone denounced him to the NKVD and he was exiled, right? So I do think there's value in mocking fascism and fascists, you know, in the Mandelstam model. I think we just have to be careful about how we do it and what the collateral damage is along the way. Like, make sure that like fat people and gay people who are also targets of this kind of eugenic loathing aren't the people you're inadvertently targeting.
Right. I think that that's a good way of getting to kind of the main point of your book, right? Toward the end, right? Where you get into, I think the chapter is called We Keep Us Safe, right? And how you define the we and the us there is crucial, right? And I think that's embedded in what you talked about there with the humor, right? Is that vision of who the us is, if it's exclusionary, if it's, you know, fat phobic, transphobic, you know, homophobic, racist itself, right? That this gets in the way of creating an us that we want to actually keep safe. So last question from me, and then I'm just going to post. So we've got a few questions already lined up from the audience. Audience members, if you're still listening, which I imagine you to be, this is such a weird space. I'm talking in my living room, which is empty right now, but hypothetically there are people listening. Feel free to post questions because we're going to get to the Q&A after this one last question for me. Okay, so last question, Talia, and you've alluded to this a couple of times in our conversation already, but bringing things into the present, the election is next week. I think that there is a lot of people are anxious. I'm anxious. I think many people are. On the one hand, there's kind of a desire and hope out there that if Trump loses, that this will kind of help bring some kind of relief or catharsis. On the other hand, as you mentioned, a lot of scholars of the far right are terribly nervous that this, you know, Trump is not going to take this well, and neither are his supporters. What do you think is the future of these online white supremacists that you study, these communities that you study in a post-Trump era? And you can take that as an immediate post-election era, which you alluded to, or going forward. What do you think is next for this community?
Well, they're not going to magically vanish on November 4th, no matter what the outcome of the election is, right? And first of all, I don't have any certainty that the post-Trump era will be anytime soon. Right. So I'm not confident. I know people are running retrospectives on the Trump regime already, and that confidence amazes me. I wish I had it. I don't. You know, but this isn't going to vanish. It didn't begin with Trump. It won't end with him. He may have been a shot in the arm to an extant movement and galvanized it, but you know, he's not the primary driver anymore of white supremacist recruitment. And I think what we're looking at is a Republican Party whose very youngest members are largely radicalized white nationalists. I mean, if you look at like how many incidents there are of young Republican campus groups inviting white nationalists to speak, if you look at young candidates like Madison Cawthorn, right, visiting the Fuhrer's vacation home and, you know, condemning his opponent for having an advisor who worked for a non-white man to ruin the white man. Like, you know, you can't take the white nationalist genie and put it back on the bottle. Like once one of our two parties has embraced white nationalism to the degree that it has, you know, I think you've left a giant door open. And who are the young people attracted to the Republican Party in the era of Trump? In the post, you know, Unite the Right moment, right? These are people who are galvanized by white nationalism, who are the opposite of repulsed by it, you know? And so I think that is the major thing that we're going to be contending with for generations. It's not something you can simply walk back, not on the local level, not on the state level, right? Not even on the federal level. When you have like Matt Gaetz, you know, inviting a Holocaust denier to the State of the Union. I mean, this is major. This is in the major halls of power. You know, so many white supremacists in the military, including the Marine I doxed last week for like writing anti-Semitic commentary under his own name to me. I mean, there are a lot of radicalized young people and they will be with us for a long time. I think people have this naive idea that like somehow every generation is going to be the one that ages out of racism. And like, that's just not the case. These are self-perpetuating, cunning, like cannily surviving ideas that don't just vanish from generation to generation. And as to the immediate future of these, you know, the white power movementarians that I was following online already decoupled from Trump to a degree. Like he's still their guy, like more so than Biden for sure. But he's no longer sort of the primary driving force of their lives. They view him, it's like their relationship to him is almost like the way like socialists and you know real leftists view the Democratic Party as hopelessly incrementalist, like, you know, and they want their concerns to be addressed, like the analog you know, not that wanting healthcare for all and wanting a white ethno state are the same, but I'm just right. Like, you know, if you had to draw an analog, it's like these people want an Einsatzgruppe, they want to be part of it, they want to be shooting people in the street. Trump is their version of an incrementalist by like slashing legal migration, by, you know, radicalizing the judiciary. Like, but these aren't people that are necessarily like amped about conservative judges. They like want to be out shooting brown people. So they see Trump as like an institutionalist and a moderate and an incrementalist. So their hope is not necessarily in the ballot box, but it's, you know, in the bullet. You know, and it's you know, I think that we're not going to see white supremacist mass casualty events go away as a threat to the public and to the commons, whether it's galvanizing in opposition or whether it's sort of continually being stoked by the provocateur in chief.
Right. Well, and even as you allude to in the book, like not even mass casualty events, but the kind of discrete, you know, individualized violence that this perpetuates as well, in terms of domestic violence or violence between people who know each other, that aren't mass casualty events, but are nevertheless like corrupting and corroding our entire society as well.
Right, and also the you know, the violence of driving, you know, like I have a dear friend who reported on a white nationalist this week and was driven out of her home by threats, you know, like literally had armed guards outside her home. Like there is a cost to speaking up against this stuff. You will be bombarded, you will be doxxed, your relatives will be harassed and threatened. Like you will be pressured to be silent in the most crude and violent of ways. And you know, I've spent a long time contending with what that looks like in my day-to-day life, but there are people who decide to speak up against the far right and find the roof torn off their life by some of the most violent and hateful people in the world just for being Black or Jewish or gay or trans. Like, you know, it's like an eye of Sauron, and when it lands on you, like, it can really fuck up your day, fuck up your week, fuck up your life. And that's what they do every day. It's sort of a perpetual motion harassment machine. And I don't want to discount that either.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it would be good if there was more talk about ways of protecting those folks, right? And including folks like you who are being, you know, having the eye of Sauron pointed at them, right? That's another conversation for another day. But I think thinking about what it looks like to take the kind of, you know, we take care of us, anti-fascist community, looking out for one another, to scale, and making sure people aren't left out, I think is a crucial next step. So I need to, I think, get to some questions for the Q&A. We've got a couple, maybe 15 or 20 minutes left. Thank you for, again, all this generous time you're giving us, Talia. I'll make this another time to plug the book. Those of you who have not bought it yet, we're talking about Culture Warlords. Out already. Buy it from your local bookseller. They're all
buy
these
indie
days.
if you can.
Yeah. All right. So some questions from the interwebs. First, this is a question from Maya. She writes, on the subject of humor, what do you think is the relationship between ironic racism / sexism, etc., of the online edgelords that are on 4chan, Reddit, etc., and actual right-wing violence that we've seen since 2016? There seems to be a gray area occupied by people who are not active white supremacists, but merely irony poisoned. What is their role in the rightward drift, both on or offline culture? And what do you think about people who are not looking to establish a white ethno-state, but merely enjoy lols?
I think that if you're calling someone the N-word, you can't do that ironically.
Right.
That's racism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're just like, even if you think you're being ironic, like you can't slur someone ironically.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the idea of irony poisoning, and like sometimes I feel it too, like I'm too extremely online as well. I think there's a pretty direct relationship, right? I mean, as we talked about before, like the more you're conditioned to accept things under the guise of humor, the more they become part of your vocabulary, the more they become part of your assumptions, the more they become part of your worldview. I think the ironic racism to racism pipeline is, it's not even a pipeline. Ironic racism is racism. There's no such thing as being an ironic racist. Like, you're just a racist, and you want the plausible deniability of saying that you're joking. And it's not funny, and fuck you.
Like, the distinction there, though, I think is one that's perpetuated in kind of mainstream discourse quite a bit, right? Of this distinction between ironic racism and racism, right? I think it's important, like you said, to kind of tease that out and make that, or like break down that distinction. That's right.
Yeah, well, it's like, is it in his heart? Is it in his bones? Like,
yeah.
No, is it in what he's saying?
Right.
Like, once you're going out and trying to shock someone, hurt someone by using a racial or sexist slur against them, you're engaging in the activity that you think you're just doing ironically. Like, you're doing it.
Yeah. Right. This gets back at this question of like racism as not being some kind of like innate disposition or psychological hatred for people, as much as it's the actions that people are doing. That's all you need to know is by somebody's actions and what they're saying in the world, not what makes them tick on the inside. Right.
I don't care about your heart. I don't care about your heart. I care about what you do. I care about who you are. Right. And if you're going out and using the N-word and, talking about people as monkeys or bitches or sluts or whatever, you're doing the thing you think you're not doing, like, and fuck you, by the way.
Yeah. Right. So another question, do you have a sense of what kind of conversation online leads to physical violence? I mean, it's clear that online culture and the rise of violence are related, but do you see particular red flags in the forums, or have you a sense of how one could go about making sense of the relationship between speech and violence in these groups?
That's a good question. And it's a scary question too. Like, I have a friend who was, threatened by Robert Bowers, who went on to, commit a massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, right? But she'd been threatened by a lot of other people too, who never went through with anything. I mean, the trouble with this stuff, the trouble with these chats in particular, they're basically stochastic violence, stochastic terrorism factories. And to define the term stochastic terrorism is basically the idea of kind of constantly advocating violence and hoping someone takes you up on it. These are perpetual motion machines of creating violence rooted in racial grievance. And it's very hard to determine like who's just talking shit and who is just like, and who is like maybe ready to snap, who's acquiring the arsenal. It only takes one person, one gun, to imbibe enough of this poison to act on it, you know, or as they call it, you know, like what's the term they use? Like, you know, real life, like doing in real life, right? Real life posting or whatever, to move offline. Like that's the danger. That's what scares me, is like you really can't tell who's gonna be the one of like the anonymous, you know, avatar of whatever, like racist runes or a swastika, who's gonna be that person that takes the gun, goes to the synagogue, pulls the trigger. It's really hard to tell.
Right.
And like frankly, if I knew, I would be not so scared for my life. You know what I mean? Like if I could tell you, I would be a fucking genius. But it is hard to tell, and like and I think just the fact that these are environments so marinated in violence, in which violence is the coin of the realm, makes it very difficult to determine who is just talking shit and who is ready to snap. And so, you know, I think the answer is, if you see someone talking shit, out them, call them out, humiliate them in public,
Right.
let them know they can't get away with talking shit anymore.
Right. Like you mentioned in the book, the kind of anti-fascist approach, right, of making there be social consequences for this sort of speech. Like you can get away with a lot of license if nobody's pushing back on you. And so pushing back is all we can do for now, I guess, or one step.
Yeah, I mean, I think the response to fascism, like fascism is not an individual problem. It's a political problem. It's a societal problem. And so the way to respond is, as a society, to reimpose the eroded social cost of bigotry, you know, is to pull away that veil of anonymity, is to ensure that people who are engaging in this kind of rhetorical violence have it tied to who they are. And there have been occasions, like the only occasions I know of people sort of effectively severing themselves from the white supremacist movement, is after being doxxed and experiencing consequences for that kind of speech.
So another question from the Twitters. Please talk about the demographics of these folks. Are they urban, rural, dropouts, working class? To what extent can you generalize any kind of demographic types of the folks that you studied?
Sorry, can you chat me the text of the question just so I can see it? Sorry.
Yeah, 1 second. I'm sorry, I'm using a couple computers, so I want to make sure I get the right ones.
Sorry to everyone.
You're good. There we go. Did you get it?
No.
Oh wait, I sent it to the wrong private group. This is my fault entirely there. I just did a non-digital native thing.
Your background is so pretty.
Oh, thank you.
By the way, my Skype room called my whole setup here looking like a hostage video, and I called them out, and I said they were a bourgeois enterprise.
They are a bourgeois enterprise. I agree with that assessment. Did you get it?
Okay, there? Sorry. Okay, so talk about the demographics of these folks. Are they urban, rural, dropouts, working class?
Yeah.
So they're everyone. That's a really easy answer. They are urban, they are rural, they are dropouts, they are working class, they are upper class, they are middle class. There is no socioeconomic, geographic, or like level of educational attainment that insulates anyone from being part of the white nationalist movement. And that's a statement I am happy to hammer home as many times as it takes to sink in. Everyone who is a white liberal wants to believe in the myth of toothless Cletus in his basement. Yes, like racists who are toothless Cletus exist, but that doesn't mean that all members of the white power movement are poor or disenfranchised or traumatized, you know, uniquely more than any of us, or broken by the world. And the people who are sitting around like reading phrenology books and like theorizing about like Jews being like directly descended from Neanderthals and getting into like Hitlerian esoterica aren't necessarily like working 3 jobs at a Burger King, like at Burger King and McDonald's or whatever. Like these often are prosperous people, these often are educated people. These are people with time and money to burn on guns and survivalist stuff. Like it could be someone it could be your neighbor, it could be someone in your HOA, it could be someone at your job who's trading photos of lynchings like baseball cards and laughing. There's no one demographic you can point to.
Thanks. So another question, and I'll Talia send this to you offline as well, but I'll read it. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to turn the light on.
No, you're good. Yeah. I was noticing this earlier, was right as the sun was setting. So it's like going to be a light shift situation. So I just messaged you the question, Talia, so you can read it, but I'll read it out loud as well, which is, if you want to destroy US fascism root and stock, is in quotes, how would you propose dealing with the Fascist International, which was in fact enabled by US government after 1945?
So I'm just going to seize on one aspect of the question because I'm not like super well versed in the like history of US involvement in 1945 Europe or whatever precisely the Fascist International they're talking about is. But on the subject of the Fascist International, like, yes, that's a very excellent thing. And it's something I discussed to a degree in the book, although the book is like pretty tightly focused on the United States. But, like, there absolutely is a global white nationalism. And it is alive and well in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, basically there's this idea that like any country that has ever been majority white like needs to be ethnically cleansed, and that's like a living idea. Many of the groups that I infiltrated had European members. One of my like longest conversations with a white supremacist in the book is with a Ukrainian man. Like, this is a global movement. They are globally inspired. Its primary locus might be in the United States, but our biggest export at this point is culture, and that this is an element of our culture that we export with glee and panache. And so there absolutely is a fascist international that absolutely is influenced by the United States. And I would just add, I think there needs to be a correspondingly global anti-fascist movement.
One of the elements in the book that I find really fascinating, you do a really great job drawing on Mark Bray's book and elaborating a really compelling case for anti-fascism as a kind of localized phenomenon. And so we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I wanted to just invite you to, how do you go about creating kind of an internationalist movement that is also simultaneously local, right? How do you bring that local anti-fascist struggle to scale?
I think one of my elements, one of the ways in which I see myself as an anti-fascist is as a propagandist for the movement, is to bring the principles of anti-fascism and the reality of what Antifa is to as broad an audience as possible. So I think, as many people as can be made aware of like, hey, anti-fascism is about protecting your community against far-right organizing by like physical violence as a last resort, but by lots of other means, including research and doxing and, protective flyers, guarding against people and mutual aid when necessary. I think as many people as can be made aware of what it is, there will be people who will want to engage in that kind of community protection. I think we have to have as many people as possible who recognize the alarum, the precarity of this moment, and who correspondingly decide to put more skin on the line than a yard sign, and who are ready to do battle and who are ready to fight. And so, I kind of define this book as a cri de coeur, and also a call to vengeance, and also a call to fight. That I want people to come away from it with a sense that they should be galvanized, that this is a moment of danger, real precarity. This is a movement that seeks nothing but ruthlessness, ruin, and violence against people who are marginalized and imperiled, and who take that as a call to arms. I mean, I would like nothing better than people, it is individual people deciding to protect their communities. That's what anti-fascism is. And that takes many shapes, takes many forms. You do what you can do. It's kind of a from each according to their ability situation. Not everyone is a street brawler. I'm not. I'm,
Definitely not.
Well, I got big guns actually, but
Yeah.
I'm an agoraphobe who can barely go outside on a bad day. So I'm not a street operative, but I can Google with the best of them. I was a fact checker for years, and so, and also a lot of what I do is just iterate the principles, get the word out, and so there's roles for everyone in the anti-fascist movement. You don't have to be a mask-clad guerrilla super soldier hero. It's not that hard. You just find out who your local clan is and where they work. You have to be willing to do that. It can be scary, but it's on the side of defeating a movement that's gained an extraordinary amount of power and influence in our country, and who needs ordinary people to stand up and fight back. And so I desperately hope that people come away with this from this book, not with the idea that I'm particularly brave or insightful, but that, that this kind of bravery is what ordinary people need to exhibit right now, right here, a week before this election and long after.
That's a perfect way of sending us off. Talia, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, again, do pick up a copy of Culture Warlords. It's available at your local bookseller.
The New York Times liked it, and so did the Boston Globe, and so did LitHub, and so will you, probably.
And Commentary hated it, which means you'll probably love it.
Yeah, oh my God, they hated it so much. They called it a slow motion tantrum, but they obviously also didn't read it, because they just fully, at least they said I compared COVID-19 to the Black Death, which I didn't. I compared white nationalism to the Black Death, which might have been hyperbole, but nonetheless, it's that's a pretty big error to make. But yeah, and there's also an audiobook and an ebook. If you're interested, I narrated the audiobook, so if you liked my voice here, you'll like it doing the Ashland voice and the Tommy O'Hara voice and the Ukrainian interlocutor voice. The weird part about book stuff is once you finish your book, you then instantly have to become a salesperson, and I'm much better at sitting and writing quietly in my weird hermit cage than I am confidently selling the greatest work in Western literature, Sit on a Carrot, Ernest Hemingway. This is the greatest book of all time. Obviously you have to have it. Crucial fall accessory will go well with your red sweater. But yeah, buy the book. That would be
or a black sweater, black and red, get with the Antifa colors.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I will say Nazis want to kill me over this book. So if you want to piss off a Nazi, buy Culture Warlords.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Talia, for welcoming us into your hermitage cage, as you called it, for this interview. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to the IPK for putting this on. Now, if we were together, this would be the time where we would all have wine and cheese and crackers and these kinds of things. So I hope all of you get to have wine and cheese and crackers wherever you are in the world. Thanks again, Talia. Everybody have a good night.
Bye.